In today's class, we will see about the blood supply of brain. The specific learning objectives of today's class: the functional significance of blood supply of brain. Then we will see the two major arterial systems and their branches. 3. We will discuss about the circle of Willis. 4. We will see the types of cerebral arteries. 5. We will see the blood supply of cerebral hemispheres. This we have already seen along with the cerebrum. We will briefly see about the cerebral veins. And lastly, we will discuss the relevant clinical anatomy. The brain is one of the most metabolically active organs of the body, as it depends on the aerobic metabolism of glucose. The continuous blood supply to the brain is of utmost importance because of its high metabolic demands for oxygen and for glucose. It is highly sensitive to hypoxia, that is inadequate oxygen, and hypoglycemia as well. Let us see some interesting facts regarding the brain. Although the brain constitutes only 2%, that is 1/50 of the total body weight, it receives nearly 20% of the total cardiac output and consumes 20% of the total oxygen used by the body. The consciousness is lost within 10 seconds of cessation of blood flow to the brain, and if the same state continues, an irreversible brain damage starts to occur at about 4 minutes and is completed within 10 minutes after the blood supply to a part of the brain has stopped. The cerebrovascular diseases like thrombosis, embolism, and hemorrhage are the third most common cause of death, and the neurological signs depends on the site of lesion. Therefore, an adequate knowledge of the blood supply of the brain is essential for the proper diagnosis and treatment of these diseases. The brain is supplied by the paired internal carotid and vertebral arteries via an extensive system of branches. In other words, we can say that the brain is supplied by two systems of arteries: the vertebral system consisting of a pair of vertebral arteries and the carotid system consisting of a pair of internal carotid arteries. First, we will see about the vertebral system, otherwise called as the vertebro-basilar system. As you know, the vertebral artery, which is a branch of the subclavian artery, ascends in the foramina transverse area of the upper 6 cervical vertebrae. On reaching the base of the skull, it winds backwards and medially around the lateral mass of the atlas and pierces the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane to enter the posterior cranial fossa through the foramen magnum, and then it runs on the anterolateral aspect of the medulla. The two vertebral arteries unite at the lower border of the pons to form the basilar artery, which ascends in the midline on the ventral surface of pons, and at its upper border terminates by dividing into right and left posterior cerebral arteries. So, the two vertebral arteries unite at the lower border of the pons to form the basilar artery. It passes upwards on the ventral aspect of pons through the basilar sulcus, and at the upper border of the pons terminates by dividing into right and left posterior cerebral arteries. We will see what are the branches from the intracranial part of the vertebral artery. The intracranial part of the vertebral artery gives rise to 5 branches. We'll see them one by one. Anterior spinal artery. The anterior spinal artery is a small branch arising near the termination of the vertebral artery. It descends in front of the medulla and unites with its fellow of the opposite side at the level of the lower end of the palate to form a single median trunk. Then it descends along the anterior longitudinal fissure of the spinal cord. The posterior spinal artery arises from the vertebral artery. It can also arise from the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. The posterior spinal artery passes downwards on the posterior surface of the spinal cord after dividing into 2 branches. One goes along the medial side and the other along the lateral side of the dorsal roots of the spinal nerves. The largest branch of the cranial part of the vertebral artery is the important posterior inferior cerebellar artery. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery arises near the lower end of the palate, winds backwards around the medulla, and then ascends to the pontomedullary junction. Then there are the meningeal branches, which are small and supply the dura of the posterior cranial fossa, and the minute medullary arteries, which supply the middle. We will revise the branches of the vertebral artery. The intracranial part of vertebral artery gives rise to 5 arteries: anterior spinal artery, posterior spinal artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, meningeal arteries, and medullary arteries. The intracranial part of the vertebral artery gives 5 set of branches, namely the anterior spinal, posterior spinal, posterior inferior cerebellar, meningeal, and medullary. As we have studied already, the basilar artery is formed by the union of the 2 vertebral arteries at the lower border of pons. It ascends in the basilar sulcus on the ventral aspect of the pons in the cisterna pondis and terminates at the upper border of the pons by dividing into right and left posterior cerebral arteries. We will see what are branches of the basilar artery. Like the vertebral artery, the basilar artery also gives off 5 sets of branches. Pontine branches. These are numerous, short, slender paramedian vessels which pierce the pons to supply it. Anterior inferior cerebellar artery. The anterior inferior cerebellar artery arises close to the pons and runs backwards and laterally, usually anterior to the 7th and 8th cranial nerves. Then it forms a loop over the flocculus of the cerebellum and peeps into the internal acoustic meatus for a variable distance, lying below the 7th and 8th cranial nerves. After exit from the internal acoustic meatus, it supplies the anterolateral portion of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Labyrinthine artery is a long, slender branch which arises either from the basilar artery or from the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It accompanies the vestibulocochlear nerve and enters the internal auditory meatus to supply the internal ear. Please note, the labyrinthine artery is an end artery. The fourth branch is the superior cerebellar artery. The superior cerebellar artery arises close to the superior border of pons, runs laterally below the oculomotor nerve, and winds around the cerebral peduncle below the trochlear nerve to reach the superior surface of the cerebellum, which it supplies. The posterior cerebral artery, which are the terminal branches of the basilar artery, passes laterally parallel to the superior cerebellar artery, curves around the midbrain to reach the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere beneath the splenium of corpus callosum. Let us revise the 5 branches of basilar artery: pontine arteries, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, labyrinthine artery, superior cerebellar artery, and posterior cerebral artery. Now we will see about the internal carotid system. The internal carotid artery, as you know, is a terminal branch of the common carotid artery, traverses the carotid canal in the base of the skull and enters the middle cranial fossa beside the dorsum sellae of the sphenoid bone. Here, it first runs forwards along the floor and the medial wall of the cavernous sinus and then turns upwards on the medial side of the anterior clinoid process. At this point, the artery pierces the dural roof of the cavernous sinus and also the arachnoid matter to enter the subarachnoid space. For convenience of description, the internal carotid artery can be divided into 4 parts: cervical, petrous, cavernous, and cerebral. After reaching the subarachnoid space, the internal carotid artery first runs backwards and then upwards to come to lie lateral to the optic chiasma just below the anterior perforated substance of the brain. At this point, the internal carotid artery terminates by dividing into 2 branches: a larger middle cerebral artery and a smaller anterior cerebral artery. So the 2 terminal branches of the internal carotid artery are the middle cerebral artery and the anterior cerebral artery. The intracavernous and the supracavernous course of the internal carotid artery forms a typical U-shaped bend or a hairpin bend, which is called as the carotid siphon. Please note the term carotid siphon. We will see the branches of the cerebral part of internal carotid artery. The first branch of internal carotid artery is the ophthalmic artery. The ophthalmic artery arises from the anterior convexity of the carotid siphon and enters the optic canal to reach the orbital cavity to supply the structures of the orbit, including the eyeball. The posterior communicating artery. The posterior communicating artery arises close to the termination of the internal carotid artery. It runs backwards and anastomoses with the proximal part of the posterior cerebral artery. Anterior choroidal artery. The anterior choroidal artery is a long, slender branch which arises just distal to the origin of the posterior communicating artery. It courses backwards along the optic tract to enter the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle through the choroid fissure to end in the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. The anterior cerebral artery. It is a smaller terminal branch of the internal carotid artery. It runs forwards and medially above the optic nerve to the commencement of the median longitudinal fissure of the cerebrum. Here, it comes very close to its fellow of the opposite side and gets joined with it by a short transverse vessel which is termed as anterior communicating artery. The anterior cerebral artery then curves around the genu of the corpus callosum. The middle cerebral artery is a larger terminal branch of the internal carotid artery. It appears to be the direct continuation of the internal carotid artery and carries about 30% of the carotid blood flow. The middle cerebral artery first runs laterally in the stem of the lateral sulcus and then turns backwards and upwards in the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, where it breaks up into frontal, parietal and temporal branches which emerge from the lateral sulcus and run towards the areas of supply. To revise the branches of internal carotid artery, they are ophthalmic artery, posterior communicating artery, anterior choroidal artery, anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery. Now we have seen the branches from the three major arteries that supply the brain, namely the vertebral artery, basilar artery and internal carotid artery. It is interesting to note that each of these major arteries gives 5 sets of branches each. The vertebral artery gives off 5 branches, the basilar artery gives off 5 branches and the internal carotid artery gives off 5 sets of branches. A total of 15 sets of arteries that supply the brain. Out of these 15 branches, 3 are cerebral, namely anterior, middle and posterior, and 3 are cerebellar, antero-inferior, postero-inferior and superior. The major arteries supplying the cerebrum, namely the branches of the basilar and internal carotid arteries, get interconnected to one another at the base of the brain to form a 6-sided polygon of arteries called as the CIRCULUS arteriosus or the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is formed around the interpeduncular fossa at the base of the brain and lies in the interpeduncular subarachnoid system. Now we will see what are the arteries that form the circle of Willis. Anteriorly, it is formed by the anterior communicating artery and the anterior cerebral arteries. Posteriorly, it is formed by the basilar artery dividing into the 2 posterior cerebral arteries, and laterally on each side, the circle of Willis is formed by the posterior communicating artery connecting the internal carotid artery with the posterior cerebral artery. So, the circle of Willis is formed anteriorly by the anterior communicating artery and the anterior cerebral artery, posteriorly by the basilar artery dividing into the two posterior cerebral arteries, and laterally it is formed by the posterior communicating artery. The circle of Willis is of great functional significance as far as the arterial supply of brain is concerned. Normally, there is very little or no mixing of blood streams, that is, of the two vertebral arteries in the basilar artery, the two anterior cerebral arteries in the anterior communicating artery, and the internal carotid and the posterior cerebral arteries in the posterior communicating artery. Therefore, the right half of the brain is supplied by the right vertebral and right internal carotid arteries, whereas the left of the brain is supplied by the left vertebral and left internal carotid arteries. However, if one of the major arteries forming the circle of Willis is blocked, the circle of Willis provides the various alternate routes for collateral circulation like an arterial traffic circle. So, the functional importance of the circle of Willis lies in the fact that it provides the various alternate routes for collateral circulation in blockage of one of the major arteries forming the circle like an arterial traffic circle. The circle of Willis is an important question which can be asked in your examination either as a short note question or as a diagram question. The circle of Willis is formed anteriorly by the anterior communicating and the anterior cerebral arteries, posteriorly by the basilar artery dividing into the two posterior cerebral arteries, and laterally on each side by the posterior communicating artery that connects the internal carotid with the posterior cerebral artery. And it is functionally important in regard that if one of the major arteries forming the circle of Willis is blocked, it provides the various alternate routes for collateral circulation of the brain, just like an arterial traffic circle. So in this session, we have seen the functional significance of the arterial supply to the brain, the two major arterial systems that supply blood to the brain, namely the vertebro-basilar and the internal carotid systems, and we have also seen the intracranial branches of the three major arteries, the vertebral, basilar and internal carotid arteries. And lastly, we have seen about the formation and the functional significance of the circle of Willis.